Great question. At the beginning of the class here in Roswell, was all days count, or a confirmation rather that all days count? That is true. Every day is counted. You know, there's very few reference to business days or banking days, with the exception of the earnest money default. And if a deadline happens to fall on a weekend or a holiday, it just happens to fall on a weekend or a holiday, which is why looking at a calendar can be helpful. The only date or event that is different than that is the date of the closing. So at the closing work, if we happen to still miss it and we accidentally scheduled the closing on a date that turns out to be a holiday, it would naturally just extend to that next business day. 8-day unilateral right to extend the contract for limited reasons. It's not a free-for-all. If it's truly due to no fault of the buyer and the lender needs more time, the buyer could choose to extend the contract up to 8 days. They would need to do that extension on or before the date of closing. Don't let the contract expire. You'd either want to unilaterally extend it to 8 days or do an amendment to extend the date of the closing. Any questions about the GAR contract? And as we kind of transition over to look at our conventional loan exhibit. We are doing well with our time today so far. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull up the conventional loan exhibit. Now I get a lot of requests to go over the loan exhibits. The cool thing about the GAR loan exhibits is they're all set up almost exactly the same way. The biggest difference is going to be with the way that they handle appraisals. So as this is loading, conventional and cash, if the property does not appraise, it's not an automatic right to terminate, it's step by step. If it's FHA or if it's VA, because of the Amendatory Clause, which is their appraisal contingency, if the property doesn't appraise, the buyer could choose to go ahead and terminate. Now, usually buyers will request a price reduction, even with FHA and VA. They usually want to make it work. Okay, so with the conventional loan exhibit, I would go ahead and I would label this to match the way that I had it labeled on my exhibits page in the contract. Some of the information is going to auto-populate. Now, in most cases, it's going to be a first loan. Whatever that percentage happened to be, you want to fill that in. Big fan of communicating with the lender. It might be on the pre-approval letter. Some of it might not. Hopefully it is, but really getting that information from the lender. If you want to bump it up just a little bit, just in case it changes, that is fine. We usually just don't go below the information that they give us. Most of the time it's going to be a 30-year, maybe it's a 15, usually going to be 30. I'm backwards in my mind, right? There we go. All right. I appreciate you guys catching me on that. And this could be different. Of course, it depends on how much. Maybe the buyer's putting, more down because they don't want to pay private mortgage insurance. And so maybe it's a different amount. We'd have no way to know. And if we have a loan exhibit, we are required to at least have at least these three, or it could be argued that the loan exhibit may not be enforceable, right? So one of the things the Red Book does a really good job of kind of going over and dissecting, but simply filling in the information is going to help. Usually it's going to be a fixed rate. Usually it is going to be institutional. If the seller is providing the mortgage, super rare, GAR has a separate exhibit for the seller financing. So that part's pretty easy breezy. You get down to talking about the actual lender. You do not have to identify a lender here. If you do identify a lender here, any loan denial letter, worst case, would need to come from this lender. Okay, so I see both ways. If you feel pretty confident, buyers already been working with NOC, they're sure they're going to use NOC, then I would go ahead and reference them here. Nothing requires the buyer to actually obtain mortgage financing from an approved lender. right? So that's very specifically set forth in the contract. The buyer can apply for different loans, but again, the loan denial letter, if worst case, would need to be for the loan that they actually referenced in this agreement. They cannot automatically switch over to FHA or VA. That's a huge trigger point for a seller. So GAR made that change a couple of years back, because if you move over to FHA or VA, those FHA and VA appraisals, well, the FHA appraisal will stick with the home for a couple of months. Let's talk about the financing contingency. And in a buyer's market, we would see 20 to 25 days. Anymore, we're seeing a lot of 12, 15 days. Sometimes buyers, depending on how confident they feel, will have this as 0. But that is typically, I mean, that is what is trending right now. Now, for a seller, though, and this is something that kind of food for thought to think about, sellers in general don't have a right to up and terminate a contract. Sellers don't have a due diligence period like a buyer does. But what are some of the ways that a seller could terminate? Because there are a couple of reasons a seller could terminate. One we've already talked about, and that was earnest money not being turned in. So another example of a seller having a right to terminate a contract, which almost nobody talks about, almost no one ever exercises, is a section that I'm going to fast forward to called seller's right of the seller to request evidence of buyer's ability to close. Pre-approval letter looked fine. We keep asking, is the loan okay? But they keep skirting the answer. Let's just say we're on the 16th day. So we're like, okay, we got other offers. People are calling us, investors are calling us, we're getting things in the mail. You had 15 days to get this financing under wraps. You did not terminate. And seller is just, thinking, am I going to be held hostage by this contract? Is there anything I can do? There is something that they can do. And that's what I'm going to point out here. Now, I'm not a fan of terminating contracts. I don't want it to come off that way, but this is something baked into the contract that's important to know, especially when you're with the seller. So number 7, it says, if the financing contingency ends, and it's ended, without the buyer terminating this agreement, they didn't terminate, seller shall have the right, but they don't have to request that the buyer provides seller with written evidence of their financial ability to close. It goes on to define the evidence and say a copy of a loan commitment from each lender with whom the buyer is seeking mortgage financing to purchase, stating the type, amount, and terms of the loan and the conditions for the funding will be deemed sufficient evidence. Says evidence is not a guarantee. Of course, it's not that the mortgage loan will be funded or that buyer will actually close. Buyer will have 7 days from the date seller delivers notice to the buyer to provide it. No request for evidence shall be made by the seller less than 7 days, because there wouldn't be enough time for this to play out. So we're on the 16th day. This feels strange. We're going to send over a notice. Now, something, and Jill, you're raising your hand. I'm going to come to you in just 1 second here. I do want to say just briefly about notice. Notice, when we're talking about notice in the contract, we're talking about notice from the buyer or the seller. I don't mean from you in a text or you from an email. I mean, when I say from them in writing, they signed off on it. GAR has a notice form. It's a blank notice form. You can customize in a lot of different ways. You can set it up to say, this is notice from seller pursuant to the conventional loan exhibit, paragraph 7. Seller hereby request your buyer's evidence of their ability to close. You can make it super nice and neat, copy and paste, have the seller sign it. That could be emailed, but it really needs to be signed from the seller. Seller does that, right? Then the buyer's got 7 days. I know it sounds like a long time, but we're setting our seller up as best we can, right? So number 8, just real quick, Jill, it says in the event buyer fails to provide that ability to close. Let's say the 7 days goes by and they don't do anything, and we're just really thinking, now this is really strange, right? Seller can notify the buyer that they're in default and give them I know this is a long time, but give them another 3 days to actually cure the default. So the seller again signs another notice that you are in default. We've asked you for your ability to close. You had 7 days. You have 3 days now to provide that information to cure it. Seller does it, right? Buyer still does not timely provide that information. Then the seller has 7 days that they can terminate, similar to the 7 days earnest money that they could terminate. It's not an automatic, but there are steps that can be taken that can set them up to where they could terminate. So again, this is not that well known. It is baked into the contract. I'm not encouraging terminations. I would use it with extreme caution. Notices have to be signed from the seller. Reach out to us on the broker team if this needs to be played out if you need to. But there are some ways the seller can terminate baked into the contract, even though it's not the due diligence period. Super careful with when anybody terminates a deal when they don't have a very specific contractual right. And when it comes to a seller, even with this, you want to make sure every T is crossed, every I is dotted. If they provide back something and it is a commitment letter, even maybe you don't like the commitment letter, maybe you don't like the terms, that doesn't say that the seller has to like terms. It just says the buyer needs to provide the commitment letter. Now, but if the buyer truly is not performing, they won't be able to provide a commitment letter, right? They're not doing their job. And that would at least set the seller up ultimately with a window of time that they could terminate. So another and third reason why a seller could terminate, because we talked about 2 today, would be if the closing date passes, the closing expires, and the buyer did not close, the parties did not sign an amendment to change the closing date, the buyer did not use a unilateral 8-day. Because keep in mind, the 8-day could be exercised up until 11:59 p.m. on that closing day, right? Theoretically right now. So that's why if I get a call and the agent says, well, this buyer was supposed to close at 3 p.m. today and it's 5 p.m. and the seller wants to go with another offer, I'll say, hold on, let's wait until tomorrow or even the next day, but at least wait till tomorrow, because what if that buyer tries to send over that unilateral 8-day? What's a few more hours? We want to set the seller up where there's a clear path to the earnest money, not a technicality that the seller breached because the seller terminated, and that can definitely happen. So quickly on the appraisal contingency, again, step by step, if the property does not appraise, you have a certain number of days here. Most buyers right now are going with 15 days or paying for a rush appraisal. So I'm not seeing too many longer than that, but it does happen. All right. So, and then it's going to be signed by the parties. So all of GAR's loan financing exhibits are going to be set up exactly this way. So they're not too difficult to fill out. And I also do want to talk about, we're going to jump around here just a little bit. I want to talk about counteroffers. And with counteroffers, because maybe we are working with that seller and the seller wants to make a change. Maybe it's just to the price. You are going to pull a counteroffer form. The way that GAR has the counteroffer form set up, and let's just see, I've not pulled it in, so I'm just gonna add that here. But let me just see if it'll let me show you that counteroffer form, because if you're like me, I'm very visual, so it helps me to see stuff. And here's just an example, you guys, and I think this is going to be an example of what I was talking about earlier with other states' forms and stuff, because I know that this is the GAR form with the F in front of it. I know all of the RE forms have RE in front of it, but there's this other form here. I don't know what that is. I'm going to pull it in just for fun, just to see it, but I know this is the one we want to go with. And when y'all have a counteroffer form, if something counteroffered back and forth a couple of times, it's the original offer and the final counteroffer that make the agreement. If there's are things in between that never got signed off on, it's like they never happened. So if you want something to stick, you need to repeat it. It needs to be on that last counteroffer form, or you need to do an amendment while you're in that due diligence period. Same thing with the right to request repairs. I know that I don't get that many questions. It's not as popular right now because of the market we're in. But if a buyer requests repairs during the due diligence period, in the due diligence period expires, you move beyond that, you're buying the home as is. You want that seller to sign that agreement to make those repairs within that time frame, or you have a choice to make. It's not enough to just send over the amendment to address concerns within the due diligence period. You want it accepted, or you want to terminate before the due diligence period is actually over. So this is the GAR counteroffer form. And as I mentioned, it just instructs us to leave anything blank or reference NC for no change. If it's not going to change, it does talk about a clean and conformed copy. It even references the special stip. GAR does everything it can to make everything easy for us, which is another reason why we're really lucky in Georgia. The Georgia Association of Realtors is superior from what I've seen to really any other state. We have a really good group here. But pretty simple. You've got a place here if you need to take away some special steps or add them in section F to do that. And of course, everyone is going to sign it. An offer or a counter offer can be withdrawn at any time before it is accepted. So maybe the seller sends out a counter offer, cash offer comes in, and seller's like, yes, I want to take this one. You can sign a notice to withdraw offer or counter offer real quick with the seller to officially take it off the table before they accept that other contract. But that is an option for sure. Okay, perfect example. Just agent beware. So yes, the solid source logo populated. Any form, not any form, but most forms you pull in FMLS or Georgia MLS. It's not just an FMLS thing. Maybe it's Savannah MLS. You guys are in Savannah now. I don't know if y'all knew that. Macon and Savannah. So Weissman has an office in Savannah too. So we got a big team expanding, and we got our first Savannah agent recently. So yeah, so super cool. So we're going to have us covered a lot of parts of the state. I know, but so just because this logo's here does not mean this form is okay. So it says Alabama Realtors 2022 counteroffer form. Don't use this form. Don't use it. Now, if you're licensed in Alabama, well, we're not licensed in Alabama, so I wouldn't want our logo on it. But just, and everybody does a good job with this, but I still got to tell y'all, just be careful with those. GAR forms will all have the GAR Association of Realtors, Georgia Association of Realtors logo on it. It'll have your name at the bottom. RE forms will say RE. Alabama, Tennessee, Florida, it will say their state on the form. Any questions about those terminations? Hopefully you won't face too many terminations. Everything is going to be smooth sailing for sure. A lot of this is going to be over the information that we covered today. So here's our first one. And so if you guys are virtual, I'm going to let you unmute yourself. I'll check the chat, of course, but if you want to unmute yourself, and you are inviting you to do that. So the first question, the Brokerage Relationships in Real Estate Transactions Act was established in the 90s to clarify what? There's something specific that it's kind of known for clarifying. Okay, so I've got a guess in Roswell, relationships. I've got a guess virtually for relationships, and you guys are good. Solid source agents are the best, and truly y'all are the best. But that is correct. It is, I would say, brokerage relationships, but y'all are agency arena. Y'all are close enough. Okay, so our second question. What is the best time for an agent to ask a buyer to sign a buyer brokerage agreement is debatable. The brokerage relationship, customer or client, should be discussed and established no later than when. Those are all wonderful answers. So no later than the contract, because we want that's really what I was looking for here. I would say there's actually two answers to this though, you guys. I would say definitely no later than the contract, because we want the contract to be accurate, but before you give advice if they're a client, for sure. Because at first, when someone calls in, if you guys get a lead, you're probably not gonna have someone sign something immediately, right? It's probably going to kind of ease your way naturally into that. And when they start asking questions and you guys start to build that relationship, they will have questions, if they're buyers, probably about what's it going to take to win right now, and they're going to get more specific. And there's going to be some replies that are you'll know when it happens, it's going to truly, they're going to need your advice for. So you would want to have that relationship in writing before then. Okay, so number 3, a licensee is limited to only performing ministerial acts for which the following customers or clients, and that's going to be customer. I was way too easy with that one. See, I need that harder quiz. True or false, if a buyer is deemed to have breached the contract and the closing does not occur, the seller is limited to the earnest money as a remedy. I was way too easy that day. That is true. Yeah. They are limited. The seller is limited to just the earnest money. Okay, so number 5, can you name 3 differences? I'm going to help you guys on some of these because especially like this one, but we're still going to test ourselves. Can you name 3 differences between the GAR and the RE purchase and sale contract? So in the GAR contract, baked into it, don't add a special step. Again, if you don't have to add one, don't. But there's an 8-day unilateral right to extend for qualified reasons baked into the contract. The RE contract, non-GAR contracts do not have that. I've never seen another contract have it. Now, I do have RE contract packages in FMLS. So I advise you to purchase the GAR forms if you are with Georgia, but if you choose to use RE anyway, I've already baked it into it if you pull it from the package. We as agents have to present every offer we get. So remember from your pre-license, if we get an offer on a napkin, we are still going to turn it in, right? But that doesn't mean we're going to advise our seller to take it. Yeah. More fun. Number 6. So the following has been outlawed in some states and is now frowned upon by NAR and, of course, GAR. Is it going to be the escalation clause, the appraisal gap clause, or is it going to be a buyer love letter? And it's really love letters, just because there's so much potential in a love letter to violate fair housing, especially when you're dealing with photographs of families and stuff. And so it's better to just stay away from them altogether. So while at one point it used to be kind of cute advice, now it's something that we really is better to try not to do it. You could have a fair housing compliant love letter. You just would be talking about the house and, hey, I see you're a gardener and I love to garden too. You wouldn't really be, it wouldn't be all that personal. Okay, number 7, when completing a financing exhibit stating TBD in place of the loan amount or interest rate is or is not acceptable. All right, so Roswell, everybody's saying not. Everybody's saying not in Roswell, and they're right. It's not. So TBD for anything is bad. Yeah, don't do it. Just don't do it. Don't put TBD. Again, you're opening up the door for future negotiations, which you don't want to do. If you want to amend it later, but you really want to set everything up to be exactly what it's going to be from the beginning. The FHA and VA appraisal contingency is unique in the fact it runs the life of the contract. That's true, and is referred to as the appraisal contingency, amendatory clause, or appraisal gap clause. So what is the appraisal contingency called in an FHA or a VA loan exhibit? It's actually B. So with an FHA or a VA loan exhibit, they refer to the appraisal contingency as an amendatory clause. The question comes up, an agent will say, well, I'm looking at the financing exhibit. I'm looking for the appraisal contingency. I'm sure it's right in front of me, but nothing says appraisal contingency. I would be the same way, but it's there. It's just under the it's called amendatory clause. Even though GAR bakes it into the financing exhibit, the lender will send over their own. So the lender is going to send over their own amendatory clause. It's going to be almost word for word the same thing. It's just going to be on their own form. All right, so number 9, based on FMLS rules, a property should not be shown during which of these statuses? And I'll give you hints, actually 2 of them. Registered, coming soon, or active. Jill online is guessing A and B. She's right. It is. So I'm going to be doing an upcoming sales meeting where I'm going to go over how to fill out the listing agreement, because I know listing season is coming up. A lot of people are going to choose to dive back in and sell for summer before the kids get back in school. And I'm going to also talk about the FMLS statuses and why they exist today the way that they do. But FMLS specifically says that properties are not to be shown when they're in registered or coming soon. Essentially, when they're not active. Okay, so registered status, for anybody, Karen asked, what could I quickly just say, what is registered status? Because most of us understand coming soon, even though that's changed a little bit over the years. Registered is basically a listing that's in the pre-active stage, but it's not, for whatever reason, it's not being marketed as coming soon. So some listings, before they're truly active, the seller and agent will choose to market as coming soon. But there are some cases when maybe the house, maybe there are being repairs made to the house. It would be dangerous for someone to come in. So the marketing commencement date, when it's actually going to be active, is 30 days down the road for a reason. We don't want anybody seeing it soon. It's just kind of dormant right now. That would be registered. Because what MLS says is that we have to input the listing within 48 hours after we have the listing signed. So this is a way to be in compliance, but not have it advertised. So true or false, a buyer may reasonably request access to a property at any time during the transaction, including immediately prior to closing, which we commonly call the final walkthrough. And the key is reasonable. Now, GAR does not define reasonable. No contract's perfect, not even the GAR one. So there could be some debate there, but the buyer asked to see the property because they want to have someone come in and measure the rooms because they want to have the floor replaced after they close. I would say that was reasonable. Might be scary. They don't have a right to terminate, but they would have a reasonable right to ask for access. Not that common, but it does happen for sure. So number 11, we're almost done, you guys. Which of the following statements is false regarding a seller's disclosure? A disclosure or as-is statement is required due to Georgia's buyer beware law. GAR offers a condensed disclosure, more appealing for investor sellers. Or C, a seller is required to update revised disclosure if conditions change. False is the key here. Which one's false? A, right? So a seller is required to update if they have a disclosure. They have a duty to keep it up to date. GAR does offer, which we talked about, a condensed form for sellers. But a disclosure as is statement is actually technically never required. A seller is required to disclose any hidden defects, but it doesn't have to be on any specific form. And our bonus, you guys, we're at our bonus. Absolutely, Jill. Jill says it's encouraged, but not mandatory. It's customary. I wouldn't say it's encouraged. There's different opinions on it, but it's definitely customary for sellers to fill them out, as well as the community association. If you're going to fill one out, though, you need to be careful and you need to fill it out honestly. And if you look at, because there's a lot of questions on there, and if you get that form and the seller says, well, I don't know half of this stuff, you call us. We're here to help with these kind of questions, but they're probably better not filling one out. Number 12, bonus. When a buyer is considered purchasing a property that is subject to a long-term lease, can you name one or more special steps that the offer would ideally include? This one's a little bit of a toughie here. I'll go ahead and tell you, yes, GAR has some special stipulations for the transfer of the security deposit for the lease, because the GAR contract itself says that the property is being conveyed not subject to a lease unless a lease is identified. So if a property is being sold that is leased, you would want to identify that, and we can always help you with that here. So